All right, without further ado, Mike McDonnell. So Mike and I had a chance to chat quite a bit the other night, and we've been friends for going on 10 years. So we know each other a little bit, but at the end of the night tonight, we'll probably know each other a lot better. So Mike, tell us a little bit about when you were born, where you grew up, maybe a little bit about your family.
Real quick, brief history. I was born in Lexington, Virginia in '54. My father was going to school at the University of Virginia, so I ended up spending about 3 or 4 formative years at the University of Virginia. I've got 3 siblings. Right after we graduated from college, we moved down to Florida. We lived in a little retirement town not far from a famous place that would soon become Disney World. After we lived there for a couple of years, we moved back to a little town in Virginia, not far from where I was born, and lived there for about 9-10 years. Then moved to Cincinnati in 1969. That was kind of a watershed year for me because it completely changed. I sort of felt like I left childhood and started to become a young man at that point. I went to a Catholic and graduated from a Catholic parochial high school, which was very, very macho. We were one of the sports powerhouses in the United States in that region. I then went back to school in Virginia, at the University of Virginia for a couple of years, studied architecture, then took a year off, changed majors, went back to school at Miami of Ohio, graduated there. My last semester, I came out as a gay man. Started going to the gay bars in Cincinnati.
So did you have brothers and sisters?
Yes, I've got 1 brother and 2 sisters.
Okay. So how did your family know you were gay? How were they with the whole thing?
I came out when I was in college. In fact, I was about ready to graduate when I came out. And one of my sisters was very accepting. My other 2 siblings kind of didn't care. My parents were, my mother was a little bit freaked out. My father was very homophobic, unfortunately, and he continued to be that way right until the time he died.
So just backing up a little bit, a question that interests me. How pissed off were you as a child that your parents left Orlando just before Disney World was going to land there?
At the time, there were all these rumors were going. Somebody said, "How come that all these properties are getting bought up and we don't know by whom?" It's like all these properties are up for sale. They're all getting snapped up. What's going on? We moved away just before it was announced that Disney was going to Florida.
So you said that you went off to college, studied architecture a little bit, and then switched to finance. Tell us about, you were telling me the other night about coming out and processing everything there your last semester of college.
Yeah, actually the summer of '77 when I graduated, right before I graduated, I was actually dating 2 women and then realized that something wasn't right. And I broke it off with both of them. And I felt like I basically just worked that summer, dated these 2 women. I felt like something was going on in my mind, but I wasn't sure what it was. I couldn't put my fingers on it. As soon as I got to college, within 2 days after getting there, I got approached by somebody who wanted to have sex. And so I did, and I all of a sudden realized it was the right thing for me. And I had sex one night, and then within 24 hours I had sex again.
Yeah. So you wasted no time.
I wasted no time.
Quick learner.
Yeah.
You told me something about an economy professor.
Yes, the last semester I was in college, I had a senior level econ class, and the professor that taught it was well known to be gay. Jerry Miller was his name. And it turned out there were like only about a dozen people in the class. I think half of them were gay. And I actually had sex with 2 out of the 12. So the econ class proved to be very advantageous to my coming out.
So when did you realize you were into the leather scene, and did that coincide with kink as well?
I actually knew I was into leather back when I was about 10 years old. I was fortunate enough to be one of the first people to see the very first Pepsi Generation ad. And I remember this man, the commercial, I still remember it very well. There's a camera panning along this canyon road, and all of a sudden this motorcycle comes around a corner. And I saw the man on the motorcycle with the leather jacket, and I went, that's what I want to be. And I also recall that at that age, I would go over to my aunt's house, and she'd gotten divorced, but her ex-husband had this beautiful leather motorcycle jacket, which hung at a tantalizing level above my reach. And I always fantasized about going out and wearing that jacket. I was just always enthralled by leather.
So even at a young age, you had a type.
Yes, I sure did.
All right, so you graduated from college in Cincinnati, and what next? What came next?
I started a job with a career in real estate, and ironically, the first real estate office I worked in, there was a gay man. I don't know how this happens, but he was closeted and had a wife and a child. Anyway, he immediately realized that I was gay, and then would occasionally hit on me a little bit. But ironically, during that same time, I ran into another man through a set of mutual friends. I was already starting to make friends, and this man was also selling real estate. He became my boyfriend. So I had a boyfriend within 6 months of coming out.
And very quickly after graduating college.
Yes.
So what was life like in Cincinnati, just coming out of college and starting a career? Were there leather bars? What was the scene
Well,
like?
actually, there were. It was as true of so many bars in our cities in the late 70s, early 80s. Even though Cincinnati is very conservative, it still is to this day. There were quite a few bars, and there were like probably 5 or 6 of them. Now, none of them were ostensibly leather bars, but there was one bar that was kind of like what I'm going to call a supermarket bar. It had the twinks, it had the drag queens, it had the college kids, it had the older gay men, as well as it had an element of leather men. I'd see them in their Levi's and their flannel shirts and their leather jackets. Some of them would even wear chaps. And I always found myself intrigued by them. And I actually got to know some. I actually went home with a couple of them. And I realized that that's where my future was going to be, but I didn't realize how much it was going to be that way. But the interest was there immediately.
So when did you actually locate the leather scene, the full-on leather scene, the leather community? Your first experience.
I did go home with a couple people in Cincinnati. They were very, very well known to be in leather. You'd see them at the bar when everyone else was maybe wearing, just jeans or corduroy pants or khakis. They were definitely wearing their heavier, older Levi's, or they were wearing their chaps, engineer boots, etc., leather jackets. But I quickly realized that I really wanted to go to a major bar that was all leather, and I found out about the Gold Coast and Touche in Chicago. And because of living in Cincinnati, it was about a 4-hour drive away, so I thought I'm going to start heading to Chicago and check out the scene there. I actually started going out to motorcycle stores, especially Harley-Davidson stores, and scoping out leather. And I remember going to Hamilton, Ohio, where there's a big Harley-Davidson dealership, and ended up buying my first set of chaps, pants, and jacket.
Yeah. So you told me about a story about your first trip to Chicago,
Yes.
You and your boyfriend.
Yes. My boyfriend was what I'm going to call very vanilla. He was what I'm going to call hot vanilla because he was a hot little man, had a nice little bubble butt, always had a tan, had a big dick, loved to be fucked. So whenever we would go to the baths, I would get ignored, and he would just, like in 5 minutes, somebody would be off in a corner or off in a room with him. So my youngest sister was getting married in Chicago on Memorial Day weekend in 1979, the same weekend as IML. I didn't realize that IML was taking place, but I knew I was focused on going to probably the Gold Coast. So as soon as we got through the wedding and the reception, I took my boyfriend to Man's Country, which is owned by Chuck Renslow, and dropped him off, and I sped downtown as fast as I could, parked my car under a bridge, changed into leather, and walked into the Gold Coast.
So what was that like, walking into the Gold Coast the first time?
I will never forget it as long as I live. I was excited and terrified all at once. It was a crazy mixture. But I was in there about 15 minutes, and I thought, this is where I belong. I knew that I did. I sort of knew it even before I walked in the door, but once I was in there, I started talking to men. And I realized even at the time, I didn't have black boots, I had brown boots, I knew that wasn't right, but they allowed me to go downstairs in the pit, which was exclusive to, you had to be in full gear, no exceptions, no cologne, no perfume, no polo shirts, you had to be in leather or Levi's. And I went down there and the atmosphere was just amazing, energetic, intoxicating. I thought, this is where I'm going to be.
So in the late 70s, before the age of the internet, how did you go about sorting out where the Gold Coast was and where the scene was that you were looking for?
Easy answer. There was a book. It's now a website, Bob Dameron's Guide, and I found out all I needed to know.
Yeah.
I just zeroed right in on it. I looked down the code. There was a code M for masculine, L for leather, and as soon as I saw those two initials next to a bar, I went, "That's where I need to go."
Yeah. So, 1979. You're at this point, I think, 26 years old. Last month, Bob Gunther was telling us how, as a young man in his mid-20s in the leather scene, he was sort of a rarity because most of them were a little older, and said that he was chicken and got a lot of action. Would you? I cannot picture you as chicken.
No. Maybe fresh fillet, but definitely not a chicken. I never lacked for as much fun as I wanted.
Yeah.
There were some guys my age. I tended to go towards the guys that were 10, 20 years older than me. I really liked the fact they had a lot of experience, the fact that they had knowledge and that they just simply knew what they were doing. I learned an awful lot from them. A lot of them mentored me, et cetera, et cetera. But I had no problem getting people my age.
Yeah. So that trip to Chicago, that first trip to Chicago and to the Gold Coast changed your life quite a bit very quickly.
Forever.
Yeah.
Forever.
You were telling me that you started going to Chicago just about every 6 to 8 weeks.
Yes.
And it wasn't long until you couldn't resist the call any longer.
I couldn't. I actually started job hunting immediately, and I actually lined up a job. The second or third trip I made to Chicago, I was at the Gold Coast. I met this man. I said, "I'm thinking about moving up here." He said, "I'm thinking about getting a roommate." I said, and he said, "Would you like to be my roommate?" I said, "Sure." I went to his house. He had a beautiful apartment. It was not too far from a lot of the bars in Chicago. At that time, there was a big cluster of bars in what's called Near North, just north of the Loop in Chicago. And so I lined everything up. And in February of 1980, again, not wasting any time, I moved to Chicago. And actually, ironically, my boyfriend was heartbroken and he wanted to move up with me. He thought if he moved up to Chicago, he would get me back. That didn't happen, and I really felt sorry for him. But I went up and never went back.
Okay, so now you've found what you've been looking for. You're in Chicago. How did you learn? How did you come up into the leather scene?
This dates back to a time when, before the internet, before smartphones and laptops, there were all these bulletin boards in most of the bars, particularly the leather bars, and there were even a few bold people who had personal ads, but a lot of them were ads for other bars in other parts of the country, if not other parts of the world. There were contests, there were runs that were announced, there were little flyers for joining a club, there were bar nights. So it was just like, instead of Facebook, there was just this bulletin board that had all this information. So it was the perfect way to start going to events. And somebody said, that'd be a really great way for you to learn the scene. I went to Gold Coast, I went to Touche, which was quite a ways away from the Gold Coast, but there were also a lot of other bars that were right within the proximity of Gold Coast. Right across the street was the Redoubt, which was a leather bar. Right behind the Gold Coast was Nail Hide Leathers, and about a year or so after I moved there, a leather dance bar opened up. There was a bookstore across the street from the Gold Coast. There were several other gay bars within about 2 to 3 blocks. I mean, it was kind of like a gay and leather feast in Chicago.
So tell us a little bit about, would you say there was a leather community? Were there clubs and that sort of thing?
Oh, even by that point, there were lots of organizations. There were several leather clubs in Chicago, a lot of them very active. I also very quickly learned about a organization called American Uniform Association. I joined that. I quickly got to know a lot of guys. I started going to their events across the country. Let's see, there were also, I went to my very first run, which I still have the pin up here on it, and I went to the Wild Onion Run outside of Chicago. And it was a really eye-opening event in more ways than one. I went out with kind of a sort of a leather daddy mentor of mine, and we just had an amazing time. I also, at that point, had also become aware of an organization called FFA, Fist Fuckers of America, and there was also another group, which the name escapes me. But I got involved in those guys. I became acquainted with Hellfire Club. So I was getting to know every organization, club, etc. that I could.
So you mentioned that there was a leather disco.
Yes.
So Leathermen dance.
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. But when you came to the door, again, there was a very strict and enforced dress code. If you had perfume, cologne, a polo shirt, you weren't allowed in. But if you had chaps on, there wasn't very much other fetish gear on the leather. The leather was it, leather Levi's, but you had to have boots on, black t-shirt. If you were in full leather, all the more, so they welcomed you in there. And the bar was packed. On a Saturday night, it was crazy crowd. They had a really great DJ. He played kind of on the macho side of high-energy dance music. And that bar was open till like 2 or 3 in the morning. It was crowded until basically the time it closed. And the great thing about it was that people could go to that bar when they had had enough of dancing. They'd walk a block, and there was the Gold Coast and the Readout. And once those closed, then they'd walk across the street to the bookstore. The bookstore was very busy, glory holes and booths and everything like that. So you could literally stay entertained from like 10 o'clock at night till like 5 in the morning.
All right, so Vi Johnson, we send all these videos off to the Carter Johnson Leather Library, and with each subject, Vi Johnson has given us 3 questions that we ask of everyone. So this is your first Vi Johnson question. If you could spend an evening talking with anyone in leather or kink history, who would it be? Why? What would you talk about?
It would be Guy Baldwin.
Okay.
Because he's such a respected figure, because of his professional practice, and because he simply, from everything I've read about him and the things I've seen, his writings and essays, he has a very grounded, very constructive viewpoint on the leather community. And I had an incident that happened about 3 or 4 years ago at Claw. I happened to come up next to somebody who was one of the volunteers at Claw, and they were taking tickets for one of the big events at Claw. And I think the man's name was John. John was from Michigan, somewhere in Michigan. And Guy Baldwin walked out. And Guy Baldwin didn't have his ticket. And I just turned to John, I said, "Let this man through." John said, "Why?" I said, "Just trust me. You need to let this man through." It was an oversight on his part. I said, "He's one of the most well-known leather people in the entire country, if not the world. Let him go through. He's definitely belongs."
If anyone should get in.
If anyone should get in, it would be Guy Baldwin.
All right. So 1980, you, having lived in Chicago, I guess for a few months.
Yes.
You went to your first IML.
Yes, went to my first IML, had a great time. Again, it just reinforced the notion that I was where I should be. I was having a great time, was very turned on by all the men, et cetera, et cetera.
And then you had, at that point, gotten your own place as well.
I still actually was living with my roommate.
Oh, okay.
And then about a year later, I moved into my own apartment here.
So tell us how you came to be Mr. Touché.
Well,
in 1982.
In 1982, I continued to really enjoy the Gold Coast. I liked going to Readout. I liked going to the leather dance bar. There was another bar that I went to. There was a dance bar. It was only about a block from where I was living. But I heard about Touché. The minute I walked in the door and spent some time there, I realized that was my favorite leather bar, and it still to this day is kind of a watermark for everything else, our benchmark. It's not in the original location, which I'm really sad to see. But the great thing about Touche's, among many others, was that it had a very friendly atmosphere. It was a very serious leather bar without being too serious about itself. The upstairs bathroom was great for wet play. It also had a patio that was fenced in, and that patio was very busy. Even during the dead of any of Chicago's most bitter winters, there were guys out on that patio, at a minimum talking, and in some cases doing more than just talking.
So how did you become Mr. Touche?
Well, I'd met the owner of the bar, Chuck Rodeker, and I also met the man who was the current Mr. Touche. Chuck Rodeker was somebody who did not care for contests. I actually went to several contests by that point. I went to the Mr. Goldcoat's contest, been there a couple of years, and I had a great time at the contest just watching and observing. And Chuck Rodeker was interested in me becoming Mr. Touche, but he went through the current, at that time, the current Mr. Touche, and said, I want you to vet people and tell me who you recommend. And after talking to this man, he went to Chuck Rodeker and said, I think Mike would make a great representative for the bar. And Chuck and I had a discussion. He said what he wanted to do, what he expected of me, and I was very comfortable with everything that he asked me to do. He basically wanted me to be a spokesperson and to attend a lot of events. Even despite that, I was doing a lot of fundraising at that bar. I did fundraising for not only the bar, but I also did fundraising for charities, and I also did fundraising for American Uniform Association. So I tried not to become overexposed, if you will, but I was very active there.
And that led you to actually compete at IML?
Yes.
Early on?
Yes, I was Mr. Touche in 1982, and I competed at IML in 1982. And see the medallion here. I also tonight brought with me the actual contest number that I got, and I have a old issue. Yes, it's older than some of the people in the room, but it dates back. It dates back to 1982, and I was on the cover of Gay Chicago for that issue. Yes, I've got it with me. So.
All right. So you said you started going to some of the runs, and the Wild Onion run was the first one. What was a run like when you were first going to them?
Back at that time, it was like a lot of runs now. It was definitely an outdoor run. They had some cabins. People brought their tents. They had a dance floor they set up. They also had a lot of food. They had food set up so they would make sure that everyone got fed. There were some, what I'm going to call sort of little places where you had different kinds of play. I remember, and yes, I found it immediately. I found the water sports area and the fisting area, and had lots of fun in them. At one point, there was a little bit of a scare, but somebody heard a siren going off, which was very unusual considering how far out we were in the very fringes of suburban Chicago. And the siren went away, so everyone was okay. But it was a very busy night. There must have been probably 100, 150 guys that showed up. So there were a lot of people, a lot of club members. People came from Indiana. They came from Wisconsin, sometimes Iowa, from anywhere from 3 to 4 to 5 hours away from Chicago. There were some guys from St. Louis. So everybody would descend on these runs because it was before the internet, before Facebook and all the hookup apps. So everybody would go there to meet people and have fun.
Yeah. So it would be parties and play and all weekend long, and they were mostly campouts.
Yes.
When did you start riding a motorcycle?
I actually didn't start riding a motorcycle until I moved to Maryland. I've always wanted to ride, and I just kept putting it off, and I finally thought when I moved to Maryland I'm going to ride, and I bought a series of motorcycles, and I now own 2 motorcycles.
So, did you have any mentors as a young man?
I had lots of mentors.
Okay.
One of the easiest ones, of course, was Chuck Rodeker. he was a mentor from the standpoint of being sort of a business owner, very much into marketing. He made a lot of trips around the country. I also had the chance to meet Bob Dameron. And Bob Dameron and I got along extremely well, and I actually went out to San Francisco and hung out with Bob Dameron in San Francisco. I was even invited to his home in Noe Valley in San Francisco, which that was a whole story in and of itself. But I ended up also having a whole series of mentors. I actually had a leather daddy for a while, who the two of us went all over the United States. He had a job that took him all over the country. We would basically check into a hotel, go out to dinner, then get into our gear and hit the leather bars in town, and then drag whoever back to the room or take people back to the room and just have our way with them and have a great time.
So you were telling me some of those stories with your leather daddy mentor, and one time that you went to New York City.
Yeah, one time in New York City we went out to dinner, and then we hit 2 or 3 bars. Then we made a stop at the Mine Shaft. I know it sounds like overscheduling, but hey, it was a lot of fun. So after we made it to the Mine Shaft, we ended up, I ran into somebody who I knew from Chicago who was a big water sports bottom. Of course, that was one of my stops at the Mine Shaft, was go to the water sports room. And anybody who's ever been there knows that they had 2 or 3 tubs, and they had a whole bunch of corners. And let's just say that if you walk in the room, you better not be afraid of splashing as your boots hit the floor, because there was lots of moisture on the ground everywhere. And I ran into somebody I knew from Chicago who had just moved to New York City. And this man, who's my friend, actually knew a couple other people. And I met this couple who was very hot. So my leather daddy and myself and these 2 guys went back to our hotel room. Let's just say that we essentially fucked all night long. And all I can tell you is that in the morning, I woke up and went, oh my goodness, this room stank to high heavens. Probably just about every bodily fluid you can imagine was on the sheets, on the floor, etc. And I'll never forget, we packed up, and I'm just thinking, oh, this place, after a shower, the smell was just even more intense. And as we're sitting there, we heard the knock on the door of one of the housekeepers, and she was anxious to get in and clean up the room early. And I thought, oh golly, I want to be out of this room before she lays out.
There was another night that you were were at Mine Shaft doing what I'll call a relay race.
Yeah, I was. It was in 1980. It was Labor Day weekend of 1980. I happen to be blessed with an amazing memory for the most part. But my then roommate, who I first lived with in Chicago, his name was Dennis. Dennis and I were hitting New York City, and again, overscheduled, but having a great time. We went dancing one night, but we agreed that we were going to go to the Mine Shaft. And I already was aware of a lot of things going on in the gay world, and I thought, well, this might not be the greatest night, because probably a lot of people are going to be in Provincetown, or they're going to be in Fire Island. And it was a typically hot, humid, sticky Labor Day weekend in New York City. Much to my surprise, we got to the Mine Shaft, and I think I was wearing boots and maybe a black t-shirt and Levi's, which was absolutely appropriate. And I got there with my roommate in tow, and the place was just jammed with men. Just amazing. I thought, okay. And this was back in a certain days before the HIV/AIDS crisis. So the Mine Shaft, in addition to having a couple cruise bars, they also had a water sports area, and then they had this area which had bondage racks, St. Andrew's crosses, and they had a row of slings. So there was a can of Crisco laid out next to every sling. And I worked my way through every sling in the place sequentially. I just went bang, bang, bang. So the very last man I fisted, I was standing there, and it's starting to get late in the morning, and I'm in the middle of this man. My elbow is about to disappear up inside him, and all of a sudden I feel this tap on the shoulder. It's my roommate. He said, it's time to go. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. He says, it's time to go. I said, I'm a little bit busy. Give me a couple of minutes. So
my hands are full right now.
My hands are, my one arm especially is very full. So I went ahead and finished up with this man, and then proceeded to go to the bathroom and clean up a little bit. There was no hot water, no water at all, no towels, no soap, no toilet paper, no nothing. So I said, okay, you're going to get us back to the hotel. You're going to get out the money for the subway tokens. We got on the subway, and my arm smelled so bad that people even in jaded New York City would get on the subway car, and they'd take one whiff and step off.
So you were that guy.
I was that guy.
And that's for the homeless people.
Yeah, not even homeless people come there.
Oh my. So, there were quite a lot of parties and quite a lot of late nights.
Yes.
I don't know if, I think most people might call it a walk of shame. I suspect you might call it a walk of honor, but you were telling me about walking up Santa Monica Boulevard one Sunday morning.
I was out in Los Angeles on a business trip, and I was there for a whole week. During the middle of the week, I wanted to go out and have a good time. Of course, in LA, I didn't have a car. In LA, if you walk, even if it's just a short distance and something is wrong, and people will actually heckle you just for walking on the street. I was out in a very nice, lush suburban area. It's very beautiful. I went out to a bar and walked about 45 minutes, got out there, hung out, had a great time, brought somebody back to my motel room. I got him kicked out just in time to get showered and have my boss, the person who was giving the seminar, pick me up. And we did it. When Friday afternoon came, I'll never forget this. There was a lady in the group that we were participating in, and she dropped me off in LAX. I had a friend in Cincinnati who had a gay couple that he knew in Los Angeles, and I'd already called him. This was before cell phones. I called him, and we made arrangements for me to stay at his house with his partner. I'm just going to call him Mr. and Mr. LA. So they had a house, I think, in Silver Lake. Well, as the car is pulling off after dropping me off, my luggage is sitting on the curb. Up pulls the pickup truck of this one man with whom I'm going to spend the weekend with. I'd never laid eyes on him or his partner ever before, but I had talked to him on the phone. They took me, I went back to their house, we had a light dinner, and then we went out party hopping and bar hopping in the San Fernando Valley. We went to a place that I'll never forget called Oil Can Harry's. The next morning, I woke up in somebody's bed somewhere in Los Angeles, and the man happened to know this couple and took me back to the house. And of course, when I walked in the door, it was like a walk of shame. They were all clapping. And so they said, just wait for Saturday night. We've got a whole schedule planned for you. So our first stop Saturday night, of course, this was back at a certain day when other things other than drinking took place. But our first stop was the Circus, which is a well-known disco in Los Angeles. And we hung out there and had a great time. Our next stop was a bar called The Probe. And if anybody who doesn't know this, The Probe was actually in a movie, among others. It was in American Gigolo. There was a scene where Richard Gere was going into a dance bar with a strobe light going, and that was The Probe. And the guys who I was staying with said to me, of course, this is already Saturday night. I'd yet to sleep in any of the beds or the guest bed in their house. And they said, okay, whatever happens, just know that if you need to come home, just first you need to find us, which we'll be around. But they said, we've got a real treat in store for you because we're going to go to the Probe. And the only way you go to the Probe was if you were a member or a guest of a member, or unless you were exceptionally high. And I remember coming up to the intake desk, and there was somebody who was being turned away. Well, they'd already made arrangements, because they were members, and they said, we're going to show you a spot to hang out while everybody comes in. We got there a little bit early. This is like, by this point, it's like 11 o'clock, and it's still a little bit early even for LA. So they had me stand in this one corner. For 45 minutes, I stood there and watched this parade of men come in. And to this day, never before, ever since, have I seen so many handsome, cut, chiseled, buff, stunning, handsome men come in one place, ever. It was just like, 45 minutes, I'm like, I'm on overload. What's going on? Well, I was hanging out in the bar, dancing, having a great time. Of course, I had this sort of already base of friends, so to speak. And the next thing I know, I meet this couple from Laguna Beach. And then we go to this motel on Santa Monica Boulevard that rents by the hour. Had the mirror on the ceiling, the whole 9 yards. And so we're partying and having a great time and having lots of sex and everything. And by this point, the sun's coming up. And they said, you know, it's really time for us to go to church. And I said, church? And so then we proceeded to go to this bar that was open at like 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And by this point, you know, the palm trees are gently swaying and the sun's out. So we went to this bar, and literally there were people dancing on the tables. I still had not gone to sleep, and I had not been back to this couple's house yet. I actually hooked back up with them, and they had a whole set of friends, and we got together. There must have been 6 or 8 of us. We were walking down Santa Monica Boulevard, and they started yelling at people that were staying at, or that were hanging out at a cafe on Santa Monica Boulevard. So there was outdoor seating, and so they were heckling us, and we were heckling them back. And so that was my walk of shame. And we were all wearing the same clothes we'd worn the evening before.
So it seems that as you were finding leather culture and coming out into leather, coming into your own, you were doing so right off the bat as a top.
Yes.
And so often we're told the best way to learn how to top is from the bottom, but you didn't do it that way.
No, I didn't. And occasionally a couple times I would just sort of do like what I'm going to call sort of a test drive and see what it was like to be a bottom. And I realized it was okay, but it didn't do anything for me. And I completely and utterly realized with every passing minute, every sexual encounter, every play session, every orgy, whatever I went to, that I really liked the roll top. It just was easy. It came to me. That's not to say that I don't appreciate who a bottom is. I absolutely do, and I really believe in the age-old adage that most bottoms are bigger and better men than the tops in which they play with. The other thing too is that when I buy toys or gadgets or gear, more often than not I test it on myself, depending upon what it is, just to make sure that I know what it feels like to have it done to somebody else.
So your mentors that you were telling me, your leather daddy mentor, you were both tops, and you
Yes.
were going out attacking the world as a team,
Yes.
so to speak.
Yes.
Before we leave Chicago, you started out as a top, always been a top. You were quite a masochist, and you told me a story.
Our sadist?
Yeah, sorry. Sorry. You told me a story about something about a roof.
Yes, there was it was a beautiful October evening, and it was probably 1984. And I had a partner in the early 80s. He was a very nice man. He was into leather a little bit, but there were a lot of people into leather at that time that were like, they'd have a pair of chaps, they'd have a leather jacket, and they'd go to the leather bars, but they weren't really into the kink side of things. And that was okay. He was a very, very pleasant man. He traveled a lot for business. So he was out of town, and we had an open relationship. So I went out to Touche's and ran to my best friend. We made arrangements to get together, and we were hanging out having a beer, and I spotted this man. And my friend said, oh, I talked to this man, and I'm not that interested. I said, well, he looks kind of hot to me. So I went up and talked to the man. And I immediately realized, I just sensed that I was going to have a great time with him. So I looked at him and said, okay, you're going to follow me home, you're going to drive in your car behind me, you're going to follow my instructions exactly. When I pull into the garage that I'm going to park my car in, you're going to park your car right in front of that, and you're going to follow me up into my apartment. He did exactly that. We walked in the apartment. The next thing I did was I had him stripped down, I blindfolded him, tied him up, and then walked him down the entire length of the building. It was an older high-rise building right near the lake. I walked him all the way to the back of the building into this grungy service elevator, took him to the top of the stairs, handcuffed him to a ladder that went to the very top of the elevator shaft, and proceeded to piss all over him, beat him up, slap him around. And I had him blindfolded the whole time, and I was taunting him while I was doing all this. And I said, this has got one of the best views in Chicago. You can see all the way down to downtown Chicago. You can see all the way up to Evanston. I said, but you're never going to see this view, at least not with me. So when I was finished with that, I took him back down the elevator, back down the hallway. Mind you, at this point, it's probably 1 in the morning, and there was no one. I walked him all the way from the back to the very front. And then I got him into my apartment, threw him down on a blanket, an army blanket that I had, fucked the hell out of him, took his blindfold off, said, "Now get the fuck out of here." I never saw him again.
Hey, I need a cigarette.
Yeah. Those views. Okay, so moving on. So it's 1989, and you're beginning to get motivated to leave Chicago.
Yes.
Why was that?
The 80s was very, very rough in Chicago. There was my very best leather buddy, to which I was just referring. God rest his soul. His name is Lowell Higgins. He was from Austin, Texas. Very, very bright man. Had a great computer job. Very handsome. Went to Symphony. Very talented man. Had a beautiful condo, the whole 9 yards. Well, he was one of the very first people in 1983 that got diagnosed with HIV/AIDS in Chicago. There were 14 people that got diagnosed. He was one of the 14. You can't believe how devastating that was. He died a year later, and there was just a whole series of men that started coming down with HIV and AIDS. There was one day, sometime in 85 or 86, when I was visiting friends in the hospital. That became sort of a routine thing. There were some people who wouldn't do it. There were so many people that I liked and cared about that I said, I'm going to go and see them in the room. I don't care. There were people who were petrified. At that time, they didn't know how HIV and AIDS were spread. So a lot of people were scared to death to get even went anywhere near somebody. And a lot of people didn't want to be associated with it. Even though they were gay men, they did not want to have any association whatsoever. And I thought, screw all that. I want to see my friends and support them. So I went in. I remember one day in particular, it was during the winter, and I was in between hospital 2 and 3. I'd been already visited 2 friends in 2 different hospitals, and I was on my way to visit a 3rd, and I probably looked like a crazy person. Because I walked out in the building, the wind was blowing, it was bitter cold, and I just went, what the fuck is happening? But I went to the 3rd hospital, visited the 3rd friend. And so I continued to have a lot of fun. I continued to go to a lot of events, but that specter of that had definitely come in. I'd start changing a lot of my sexual habits. I still continue to do a lot of crazy things, but very safely. And I realized, and I belonged to a great church. I had a great apartment the last 2 years I lived there. There were a lot of wonderful things, but I all of a sudden realized that I couldn't handle the heartbreak anymore. I just couldn't deal with it. I had to get away from the city. I love the city. I still love the city. There's so much there. But I knew it was time to go away. And I remember, and I didn't want to tell anybody because there would be all these people saying, no, 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 don't leave, don't leave, don't leave. And I remember going to a party in the summer of '89, right before I left, and somebody came up to me, the man who was hosting the party, he said, you're getting ready to leave. I said, well, I'm going to leave in about an hour after after I've been to your party. He says, no, 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 you're leaving the city. I said, what makes you say that? He said, I can just tell. I said, no, I'm not going to leave the city. I lied to him because I didn't want him to be upset. And I then systematically sold off things, gave things away, and moved at the very end of September of '89 to Arlington, Virginia.
So, to Arlington, Virginia. How did you find that to be after leaving what seems to be, at least for you, another Mecca?
It was a different culture. There was still a lot of leather life and so forth in DC. I actually had met someone a year or 2 before I left Chicago. So this man was an older kind of daddy also, but he would occasionally play with tops. He was extremely kinky, very imaginative, very crazy. So I got along very well with him, and he agreed to put me up while I was job hunting. I moved to Arlington without a job, without a place to stay, but I did have this man to stay with. And so we had some rather amazing times the 2 months that we lived together before I found my own place. I remember one night, about 2 weeks after I moved there, we both went out in heavy fire rubber bunker gear, and we went to the DC Eagle and hung out and had a beer or 2. And then we came back, and he was somebody who professionally knew DC inside and out. He had knowledge of a lot of things and places and spaces that no one did. So we went to Teddy Roosevelt Island after dark, and it was during a blinding rainstorm, and it was probably remnants of a hurricane. So we went underneath the I-66 overpass over Teddy Roosevelt Island and had sex under a storm drain while the water was just pouring straight down in our rubber bunker here. Hot as shit.
That sounds like a movie.
I think I had that.
So you weren't in DC long until you moved to Baltimore.
Right, I went to a Clippers party, which is a haircut party, and I met this man who owned a business here in Baltimore.
Whatever were you doing there?
looking for more fun.
More hair.
Looking for more hair. Anyway, in fact, the man who hosted these parties, his name was Roger Hardesty. He was well known in the leather and kink circles. He would have Clippers parties where he'd bring his wall clippers and give somebody a buzz cut. It was a lot of fun, and actually I had fun with him indirectly in Chicago because he had a Clippers party at Hellfire Club, and I would go there. I never became a member or an associate, but I was at the Hellfire Club from time to time, and there was a uniform Clippers party at Hellfire Club, and there was this man who was very cocky, who was an attorney, and he had to have a certain kind of haircut because he was a corporate attorney. And I ended up, there was a whole circle of people watching his hair being cut, and I decided this is the perfect time to tease him. And I was in a police uniform, so I whipped out my nightstick and I stuck it up underneath his ass while his hair was being cut, and I said, let's see how good of a bottom you are, and let's have you hold on to that nightstick. And I said, I'm going to keep pulling this nightstick out, and I'm going to ask you if you've got it, all the while he's getting his hair cut. And if he bumped or moved, there'd be a miscue with his haircut. So finally, I would say, do you have it? He'd go, yeah. And I'd pull it out a little bit more, and everybody's just watching. I say, do you have it? And then there was a point where he said, I'm not sure. And that was the end of the scene. I met this man who had a business in Baltimore, and he unfortunately had a person who was working for him who was very ill. He wasn't coming into work very much because he was just too ill with HIV/AIDS. And he offered me a job in December of 1990. I moved up to Baltimore. I lived 4 doors down from Leon's.
Convenient.
Mm-hmm.
So, what did you think of Baltimore?
It was definitely a change from where I'd lived before, both in DC as well as Chicago. One of the things that I did, of course, the boss I had, who was a gay man, he was kind of on the fringes of the leather scene, but he said, I know this club called Command. He said, I think you might like it. I think you might like the men that are in it. And he said, on top of that, he said, there's a bar that's about to open. It's called the Baltimore Eagle. He says, I think you'd like that. I said, oh yeah, I was there the night the Baltimore Eagle opened. And I also, again, it sounds like a pattern, but it is, I moved in December of 1990. In the spring of 91, I joined Command.
So, describe you talked about the gallery as well the other night.
Yes.
Describe the gallery in the Baltimore Eagle a little bit. Can you compare it to some of the other places you had been?
Well, I think every leather bar has its own flavor and its own sort of character. Even within a city, they all do. The owners play a part. The way the bar is laid out has something to do with it. The clientele, there's never really a pattern. There's never a consistency. There's always something different, which makes it exciting. So I found the leather community was a little bit more low-key in Baltimore, which I wasn't surprised. It's a smaller city. Still a lot of very fun guys, and of course I had wasted no time in throwing myself into attending lots of bar nights. Went out of town with Command. Again, trying to have as much fun as I could.
Would you say the leather community here is a little less sexually driven than, say, Chicago?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also a little bit more closeted. There are people who I found that are into kink or gear or fetish, and they don't want to let anybody know about it. They're just kind of like hidden about it, or they only do it when they're out of town, or behind closed doors. And that's okay. I choose not to live my life that way. I'm very conservative and discreet when I'm at work, but when I'm off and out, I have no fear. I wear my gear, and present myself as I am.
So that makes it a little difficult for a newcomer. How did you so quickly integrate yourself into the scene and the community here in the Mid-Atlantic?
I like to meet people. I just ended up always running into people. I thought the men of command, especially at that time, were extremely friendly, and they still are. I've always stayed in touch with all the guys in command. I finally recently refreshed my membership after over a 10-year lapse. I just simply threw myself into things like I always do. I started volunteering for stuff. I ran for office, as my best so speaks to it, and I went to as many events and runs and parties and charity fundraisers as I possibly could.
So this is like 1990, 91
Yes.
that you're getting into command, which is not long after they formed.
Yes.
What was command up to in the early 90s?
Of course, Dan Noel was still involved, and he was very driven to make the club the premier leather club in Baltimore. I actually came in right after command and had a huge, it was like what I call the second wave, as I told some people earlier tonight. It was right after this huge surge of members. A lot of them came in and were gone within 6 months. And I was like the third wave. There were 2 other people that pledged with me, and there were a number of people that pledged right after that in the succeeding probably 6 to 12 months. So by the time I was been in the club like a year, there were probably close to as many as 20 guys in the club, and we were very active. Of course, this is still before the internet was just starting to surface as a phenomenon, but we were going to events. We'd go down to DC. We had bar nights here in Baltimore. We'd go to Philadelphia. We went to New York City. We went to other places, and again, tried to get out in the community as much as possible.
So were you involved with the first Mr. Maryland Leather contest?
I wasn't. I attended the very first one I attended was the year that Troy Linhart ran, and of course he won. And yes, I accompanied Dan and Troy to Chicago.
Yeah, so that would have been maybe the you would have been in command around the second or third year.
I actually was in command I was in command in '91. I mean, that's the year they went to Chicago.
Okay. You were telling me the other night about something that you realized after moving here about helping others and part of the community involvement.
Yeah, I've always been inspired by others who did philanthropy, service work of whatever flavor. I was also very much inspired by my late mother. I will never forget one time where she was on the community landscaping committee for the suburb that my parents lived in suburban Cincinnati. And I remember coming in to see her on a surprise Mother's Day weekend, and she could barely walk because she had very bad knees, and she was at a flower bed planting flowers. No one was helping her, and I just was struck by that. Here she'd had supposedly a couple volunteers. There was no one helping her. She was in the blazing hot sun, and she was planting flowers. And I thought, and that wasn't the only time I saw her do that kind of thing, but it was always an inspiration. So I've always, to a great extent, done things. Whenever somebody needed help, I tried to help them out. I've volunteered to do various things of all different types of things. I kind of try to make my life such that no more than 2 or 3 weeks go by that I'm not attending some event, some dinner, some bar night, something where I'm helping somebody out and donating or making somebody's life better. I'm on the condo board where I live. I actually am constantly picking up trash. I'm on the parking committee for it. I'm the treasurer of the condo board. I'm probably going to hopefully become an officer again in command. So, whenever I get an opportunity to volunteer, I generally do.
Yeah. Was that something that maybe attracted you to get involved with some of the community community things that you've done here in Maryland, I assume.
Absolutely, yeah. It was, I mean, to me, it was a no-brainer. There were all these things that were available that you could do, and a lot of it was just simply showing up. But I would show up and help out in whatever capacity. One of my most amazing experiences was command and the shipmates, along with the help of some other people, through this huge party during Mr. Maryland Leather Weekend, and we actually rented a space in one of the buildings right next to Penn Station and threw this huge play party and dance party. And it was an amazing event, and it took a lot of work on a lot of people's parts. And I actually remember that right before it happened, we were getting ready to write a check, and the woman who asked me, who was the rental agent, asked me to write a check to her, and I thought that was very unusual. It turned out she was going to try to steal the check. She was going to have it written to her so she could steal the money. One of my club brothers at the time said, you know, we need to write that check out to the management company that owns the property. I said, you're right, which we did. We had the shipmates organize the drinks. There was a steam pipe that burst right before the party was held. We worked around that. We literally had cars and other stuff cleared out. We swept the floor. I had a group of people, including Troy Leonard, who came in and helped decorate the place. One of our command members was involved in the audio field. He rented equipment. There was another member of command, he's still alive, but a member of command who was a good DJ. So we organized an entire play party that was...
And disco and bar.
Disco and bar and play area.
In a garage.
In a garage, and it had a couple motorcycles. It was kind of grungy. It had a New York feel. We found this whole set of wood pallets on the dock, and we commandeered them all and brought them in and created a play space over in one of the corners of the garage. The party lasted till 5 in the morning, and I had to kick people out.
So was that fairly typical for the kinds of things that were going on in Baltimore at the time?
It was a little bit unusual. I mean, that's one of the things. There aren't as many that I've found play parties and so forth. They're much quieter, much smaller than Baltimore than they are. You know, the Playhouse obviously has changed that. I mean, of course, there was the Playhouse that burned down 2 years ago. It was a major venue as well.
Okay, so let's hit these Vi Johnson questions. Whatever were you doing there?
looking for more fun.
More hair.
Looking for more hair. Anyway, in fact, the man who hosted these parties, his name was Roger Hardesty. He was well known in the leather and kink circles. He would have clippers parties where he'd bring his wall clippers and give somebody a buzz cut. It was a lot of fun, and actually I had fun with him indirectly in Chicago because he had a clippers party at Hellfire Club, and I would go there. I never became a member or an associate, but I was at the Hellfire Club from time to time, and there was a uniform clippers party at Hellfire Club, and there was this man who was very cocky, who was an attorney, and he had to have a certain kind of haircut because he was a corporate attorney. And I ended up, there was a whole circle of people watching his hair being cut, and I decided this is the perfect time to taunt and tease him. And I was in a police uniform, so I whipped out my nightstick and I stuck it up underneath his ass while his hair was being cut, and I said, let's see how good of a bottom you are, and let's have you hold on to that nightstick. And I said, I'm going to keep pulling this nightstick out, and I'm going to ask you if you've got it, all the while he's getting his hair cut. And if he bumped or moved, there'd be a miscue with his haircut. So I would say, do you have it? He'd go, yeah. And I'd pull out a little bit more, and everybody's just watching. I say, do you have it? Then there was a point where he said, I'm not sure. And that was the end of the scene. I met this man who had a business in Baltimore, and he unfortunately had a person who was working for him who was very ill. He wasn't coming into work very much because he was just too ill with HIV/AIDS. And he offered me a job, and in December of 1990, I moved up to Baltimore, and I lived 4 doors down from Leon's.
Convenient.
Mm-hmm.
So, what did you think of Baltimore?
It was definitely a change from where I'd lived before,
Yeah.
both in D.C. as well as Chicago. One of the things that I did, of course, the boss I had was a gay man, was not, he was kind of on the fringes of the leather scene, but he said, I know this club called Command. He said, I think you might like it. I think you might like the men that are in it. And he said, on top of that, he said, there's a bar that's about to open. It's called the Baltimore Eagle. He says, I think you'd like that. I said, oh yeah, I was there the night the Baltimore Eagle opened. And I also, within, again, it sounds like a pattern, but it is, I moved in December of 1990. In the spring of 91, I joined Command.
So, describe you talked about the gallery as well the other night.
Yes.
Describe the gallery in the Baltimore Eagle a little bit. Can you compare it to some of the other places you had been?
Well, I think every leather bar has its own flavor and its own sort of character. Even within a city, they all do. The owners play a part. The way the bar is laid out has something to do with it. The clientele, there's never really a pattern. There's never a consistency. There's always something different, which makes it exciting. So I found the leather community was a little bit more low-key in Baltimore, which I wasn't surprised. It's a smaller city. Still a lot of very fun guys, and of course I had wasted no time in throwing myself into attending lots of bar nights. Went out of town with Command. Again, trying to have as much fun as I could.
Would you say the leather community here is a little less sexually driven than, say, Chicago?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's also a little bit more closeted. There are people who I found that are into kink or gear or fetish, and they don't want to let anybody know about it. They're just kind of like hidden about it, or they only do it when they're out of town, or behind closed doors. And that's okay. I choose not to live my life that way. I'm very conservative and discreet when I'm at work, but when I'm off and out, I have no fear. I wear my gear and I present myself as I am.
So that makes it a little difficult for a newcomer. How did you so quickly integrate yourself into the scene and the community here in the Mid-Atlantic? I like to meet people. I just ended up always running into people. I thought the men of Command, especially at that time, were extremely friendly, and they still are. I've always stayed in touch with all the guys at Command. I finally recently refreshed my membership after over a 10-year lapse. I just simply threw myself into things like I always do. I started volunteering for stuff. I ran for office, as my best so speaks to it, and I went to as many events and runs and parties and charity fundraisers as I possibly could. So this is like 1990, 91
Yes.
that you're getting into Command, which is not long after they formed.
Yes.
What was Command up to in the early 90s?
Of course, Dan Noel was still involved, and he was very driven to make the club the premier leather club in Baltimore. I actually came in right after Command and had a huge, it was like what I call the second wave, as I told some people earlier tonight. It was right after this huge surge of members. A lot of them came in and were gone within 6 months. And I was like the third wave. There were 2 other people that pledged with me, and there were a number of people that pledged right after that in the succeeding probably 6 to 12 months. So by the time I was been in the club like a year, there were probably close to as many as 20 guys in the club, and we were very active. Of course, this is still before the internet was just starting to surface as a phenomenon, but we were going to events. We'd go down to DC. We had bar nights here in Baltimore. We'd go to Philadelphia. We went to New York City. We went to other places, and again, tried to get out in the community as much as possible.
So were you involved with the first Mr. Maryland Leather contest?
I wasn't. Well, I attended the very first one I attended was the year that Troy Linhart ran, and of course he won. And yes, I accompanied Dan and Troy to Chicago.
Yeah, so that would have been maybe you would have been in Command around the second or third year.
I actually was in Command In 91. I mean, that's the year they went to Chicago.
Okay. You were telling me the other night about something that you realized after moving here about helping others and part of the community involvement.
Yeah, I've always been inspired by others who did philanthropy, service work of whatever flavor. I was also very much inspired by my late mother. I will never forget one time where she was on the community landscaping committee for the suburb that my parents lived in suburban Cincinnati. And I remember coming in to see her on a surprise Mother's Day weekend, and she could barely walk because she had very bad knees, and she was at a flower bed planting flowers. No one was helping her, and I just was struck by that. You know, here she'd had supposedly a couple volunteers. There was no one helping her. She was in the blazing hot sun, and she was planting flowers. And I thought, and that wasn't the only time I saw her do that kind of thing, but it was always an inspiration. So I've always, to a great extent, done things. Whenever somebody needed help, I tried to help them out. I've volunteered to do various things of all different types of things. I kind of try to make my life such that no more than 2 or 3 weeks go by that I'm not attending some event, some dinner, some bar night, something where I'm helping somebody out and donating or making somebody's life better. I'm on the condo board where I live. I actually am constantly picking up trash. I'm on the parking committee for it. I'm the treasurer of the condo board. I'm probably going to hopefully become an officer again in command. So, you know, whenever I get an opportunity to volunteer, I generally do.
Yeah. Was that something that maybe attracted you to get involved with some of the community things that you've done here in Maryland?
Absolutely, yeah. To me, it was a no-brainer. There were all these things that were available that you could do, and a lot of it was just simply showing up. But I would show up and help out in whatever capacity. One of my most amazing experiences was command and the shipmates, along with the help of some other people, through this huge party during Mr. Maryland Leather weekend. And we actually rented a space in one of the buildings right next to Penn Station and threw this huge play party and dance party. And it was an amazing event, and it took a lot of work on a lot of people's parts. And I actually remember that right before it happened, we were getting ready to write a check, and the woman who asked me, who was the rental agent, asked me to write a check to her, and I thought that was very unusual. It turned out she was going to try to steal the check. She was going to have it written to her so she could steal the money. But one of my club brothers at the time said, you know, we need to write that check out to the management company that owns the property. I said, you're right, which we did. We had the shipmates organize the drinks. There was a steam pipe that burst right before the party was held. We worked around that. We literally had cars and other stuff cleared out. We swept the floor. I had a group of people, including Troy Lenhart, who came in and helped decorate the place. One of our command members was involved in the audio field. He rented equipment. There's another member of command. He's still alive, but a member of command who was a good DJ. So we organized an entire play party. That was
disco and bar.
Disco and bar and play area.
In a garage.
In a garage, and it had a couple of motorcycles. It was kind of grungy. It had a New York feel. We found this whole set of wood pallets on the dock, and we commandeered them all and brought them in and created a play space over in one of the corners of the garage. The party lasted till 5 in the morning, and I had to kick people out.
So was that fairly typical for the kinds of things that were going on in Baltimore at the time?
It was a little bit unusual. I mean, that's one of the things. There aren't as many that I've found play parties and so forth. They're much quieter, much smaller in Baltimore than they are. You know, the Playhouse obviously has changed that. I mean, of course, there was the Playhouse that burned down 2 years ago. It was a major venue as well.
Okay, so let's hit these Vi Johnson questions.
You're really intrigued, and you'd like to have some fun. I said, I don't get discouraged, come back. And while I'm standing with him, I pressed my whole body up against him. I felt his heart underneath his jeans. And I said, now, you need to go home, it's getting late, now get out of here now. So I didn't do anything sexual with him in a sense, but just in that little action, I was dominating him, and there was definitely some BDSM going on without any kind of pain or anything else going on. I never directly touched his dick other than just with my body.
I just have a real quick question. You seem to have a lot of history. I know you very well. Do you think the art, and I use that loosely, of cruising has died?
It hasn't totally died, it's diminished. It's definitely diminished. And I think that there's sort of an electronic form of cruising going on, and I think that electronic form of cruising a lot of times is dismal. It's very bad. You know, somebody opening up their private gallery or just saying hi, or immediately is just atrocious. Also, if you're with somebody or you're in a bar or an event venue, you've got the chance to meet somebody and sort of eyeball and get a sense of who they are. You don't get that electronically. And the one thing that I found that's really, it's very frustrating, a lot of people share the frustration, is all the people who are flaky. You know, as I like to say, save it for the instant mashed potatoes, but not for a day. If you don't want to get together, don't, but don't lead anybody on. When I was down in Fort Lauderdale 2 years ago in November, I found that it's probably close to 60% of the guys that I contacted, or they contacted me, they got together with me. Here, I find that percentage is so much lower. I hope that answered your question. Yes?
If there was anything you could promote and or change within the gay or leather community, what would it be?
I would change I would encourage people to be more inclusive and be friendlier and more welcoming to everybody. Even if you're not particularly fond of somebody, or you're not turned on by somebody or whatever, come up and say hello to them. Say hi, welcome them, introduce them to people, etc., etc. I was at Twilight on the Terrace right before our Gay Pride weekend a few weeks back, and I thought there were lots of gay men. A lot of them I'd seen their faces before, and I thought, I'm not going to just stay in sort of this gay ghetto mentality. So I came up to this woman, a very, very striking black woman. I could tell she was professional. I came up and said hi to her. Turned out she was about ready to start a job with Chase Brexton. Had a great time talking to her. And she was, I think, by herself at that point. She was waiting to meet her boss, but he hadn't showed up yet. And I tried to extend myself, and I ended up having a great time hanging out with her. I had a marvelous time. And that's what we need to do more of. And especially I hear people who say, as soon as I run into somebody online, Bear 411 or Grindr or Growler or whatever, Scruff, and if I don't like what they're doing, I'm going to immediately block them. Well, sometimes that's worthwhile and it's appropriate thing to do. Sometimes it's not. You may have somebody who's just so nervous or doesn't know how to go about it, and they really might potentially be somebody really wonderful to meet. So I think that's the one thing that I find really frustrating. And it's not just for me, it's just I see it all the time. There are people I've seen wander around for hours at an event, at a bar, and no one comes up and says hello to them. Of course, on the flip side, they may not come up to somebody else either. So I always, a lot of times, extend myself and just go out and meet them.
Anyone? Rodney?
What moment will you always remember from the Mr. Touche?
Well, there was no contest.
So it was an appointed title?
It was an appointed title. Chuck Roddicker did not want to have.
And what moment will you always remember from your IML?
Playing with Luke Daniels, the winner of IML that year.
That works.
Was that a quick enough answer?
Yes.
Yes. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you all very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mike. And again, next weekend we're doing this 4 more times at CLEP, and then next month is Dan Noel. So have a wonderful evening. The year is 2025, 10 years in the future. Where do you see the community?
I see the community just as involved in their electronics as they are now, but I also see but I also see the electronics being a sort of a gateway or springboard for more socializing and interaction in person. I think that I think there are going to be a lot more people in the leather and fetish and kink community that are much younger than they are now. There's kind of a exiting of some of the people that are maybe my age or close to my age. There's going to be a whole new, they're already there, but there's going to be a surge, because I see stuff coming in sort of generational things. Every 20 years there's sort of a change, and I think we're on the swing back to people being really involved in this kind of stuff. It kind of went out of favor, so to speak, but I think it's coming back. And from what I see with all the amazing things that are out there, I mean, you open up any of the major websites and you see all these new toys and all these new gadgets and all this new gear. I don't care what you're into, you're going to find it. I also am intrigued by all the different things that are coming in as far as contests and play events. It used to be that you'd have a leather contest or a leather dungeon party. Now you've got pup moshes, you've got women that've got their events, you've got all kinds of things going on. So I think there is definitely a return, if not maybe another golden age of leather and kink and fetish coming up.
So you're looking forward to the next 10 years?
Absolutely. God willing, I'm alive, yes.
Awesome. What would you like to see as your leather kink legacy?
One of the things that I have always thought about, has been true since I was first coming out in leather, is I especially like my gear. I like playing in the stuff. I like very edgy or imaginative sex of every kind of flavor almost you can imagine. And I always hope that whenever I'm out, that I inspire and encourage others to be themselves, whatever that is, and do what they want to do, and not to be shy about it, not to hold back. I've been inspired by people over the years that I've seen that I thought they're really doing what they want to do. They're being who they are, and I think that's, I think that's what you can do. You can essentially be a mentor without necessarily having somebody right underneath your wings.
Okay. Are you spiritual?
Yes.
Can you elaborate on that? You told me that there's something you do quite often that you find to be very spiritual.
I pray all the time, which a lot of people may find that funny and amazing and maybe a contradiction in terms. But I'm very spiritual. I pray about things all the time. Of course, it's easy to pray for world peace. I do that. But I also pray for a lot of other things that are going on in the world, both local, regional, national, and specifically for various things that are going on with all my friends and relatives and people that I care about.
You were telling me something though about dress that you think what's the word?
Again, I do have an obsession with gear, and anybody who's been in my home that's seen some of my stuff knows that. Just ask me about the wall boots. What I do is, a lot of times people say, how do you figure out what to wear? And the answer is, I start sort of allowing myself to get into a Zen-like state and say, what is going to work the best tonight? What is going to hit the mood or make me feel the greatest and make me feel like interacting with a lot of others and having a good time? And sometimes it comes, occasionally I just put something on and I go, I can't make up my mind. But other times something will clearly come to me and I just embrace it.
So there's spirituality even in the most mundane things.
Yes, there is. Yes, there is.
All right. So before we take a couple quick questions from the audience, I thought I'd give you a minute to maybe make a closing remark or a message that you want to leave the audience with.
I think the biggest message is that with all the success, especially that we've had as gay men and gay women, transgender, bisexual, etc., that there's still obviously lots of things to do. There's still room to make changes. There are still some laws that are there. There are parts of the country that I have to really admire people who are lesbian, gay, transgender, bi, because there's still some bigotry and so forth. And unfortunately, some of the laws, the Supreme Court ruling, has made some people even more angry and loath to do that. But despite all that, I think there's a move towards greater freedom, and I think that we always have to remember that the minute that you think that you can't help somebody or be a source of inspiration is the minute you're wrong, because someone somewhere is paying attention. Someone is looking at you and thinking, if they can do that, if they're like that, if they can help out, if they can smile, if they can be fun, I can do that. If they can volunteer, I can volunteer. And it's there.
Questions from the audience? Dan?
I am somewhat, I'm very interested in what this leather disco in the 70s, do you remember
the
the
80s.
name of it? It was the early 80s?
It's called the loading dock.
The loading.
Nice name, isn't it? Has lots of innuendo. Yep. I remember going home to DJ from it one night.
I think the whole issue with the Leather Dance Club is kind of interesting, and you touched on this the other night when we were talking, and you were telling me about how I think we were trying to make comparisons between the leather community now and the leather community in the 80s and 90s, and you said the leather community back then didn't take itself so seriously.
They didn't. There were some people who did. There always are, and I respect those people. But I also don't think that it's appropriate for them to get necessarily on their soapbox and criticize somebody who doesn't take it as seriously. And in fact, I found ironically that somebody who's more free-spirited is actually a lot of times the more interesting and hotter and more socially engaged person. They're oftentimes the one doing more, experiencing more, and helping people more. So, it's somebody who's in a rigid little box, so to speak, is not going to be out there as much as somebody who's doing whatever they want to do.
And they're probably kinkier too.
I found they almost always are.
I would venture to bet that if you took our winning IML this year and compared him to Pup Tugger is probably a far bigger freak than our winner is.
Probably,
Much
yeah.
more fun.
Yes.
In that respect. Yes, sir.
Well, Mike, I sort of disagree with that in a sense. Don't you find that there's some people that wear leather as a costume?
Sure.
And then there's the other ones that are actually into the fetish, the kink, the BDSM, the S&M. It depends upon what it represents to them and why. I mean, first you gotta like leather. You gotta like black leather.
But you don't necessarily have to.
Well, I can't see you wearing leather if you don't like it.
Right, but there are some people who are into kink. There are men that are into kink that really don't have much in the way of leather. And you, in fact, a lot of times you won't see them out. You don't see them at events. They're not particularly interested in being social in that respect, but they're extremely kinky. I've had the fortune of running into them from time to time, and
well, it's a lot easier to connect with them now that you've got the internet too.
Yes.
So, I mean, if you remember, the basic internet was the bulletin boards. You got about 8 lines into a website, what we would term a website, but it was called a bulletin board back then.
Well, I've got a little story.
One of them was Harbor Bites here in Baltimore.
Right, yes. And of course there's Craigslist, and yes, I've actually put out ads, and yes, I've responded to ads. One of the experiences I had in Chicago was really, among many others, it was really kind of a telling thing, and I'll never forget it, was one night I was at Touche's, and at the time I lived only about maybe 4 or 5 blocks away. And so it was a beautiful summer evening, and I happened to live in at the time I lived in a building which was called a 3-flat. It was on a corner, and I had the top floor. And I had a gay landlord, and he had this beautiful patio with all these flowers and plants. And it was a beautiful summer evening, and it was time for Touche to close. I didn't want to go home, but I had to go home. And I hadn't picked anybody up, so I wasn't hanging out with any friends that night that I went home with. So there was somebody who I saw when I first went in, and my immediate gut instinct was, this man is underage. He wants to come in here so badly, but he can't, because they adore people, and the leather bars, like is still true now, the police and other people, the alcohol boards were always looking, always watching. So they have to be even more careful than some other regular bars do. So when I walked out the door, and I was of course very careful. It's like by this point 2 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden I realized somebody was following me. And I realized it was this young man, and I figured he's underage. Well, I thought, you know what? Rather than doing something, I'm going to do something that will intrigue him, encourage him, but he'll have an experience that he will never forget.
I'm not surprised.
So I walked home. I got to where I lived, and right across the street from where I lived was this big, what was called a courtyard building. There are lots of them in Chicago. It's a big sort of U-shaped building. So that one of the long walls of the courtyard building was right across the street from where I lived. So I walked in, went into the back gate, went upstairs, got a beer, and went down and sat back down on a chair in the patio. This young man did not leave his spot. He was across the street leaning against the wall of that apartment building. And I knew that he wanted me in the worst kind of way. So I thought, this is a cat and mouse game that I'm going to play a little bit. So I happened to notice that sitting in the garden, for whatever purpose, was a short piece of steel reinforcing rod. My landlord was a gay man who never left anything alone, was constantly remodeling and doing landscaping work. So I picked up the steel reinforcing rod and walked across the street, came up to the young man, and I put the steel reinforcing rod right here, just underneath his head. And I had a little chat with him. I basically told him, I said, you know what, someday you're going to be old enough to have fun. I said, I can tell.